Okay then, well, good evening everybody. My name is Alan Friedman, Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and as usual I'm your MC for this evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, and Ted Lapkin, our Executive Director, so good evening to you as well. This week we are privileged to have three expert guests to speak about Israel's proposed extension of sovereignty to parts of Judea and Samaria, and we will introduce them in a moment. The format tonight will be a little different this week. We're going to begin by showing a 10-minute abridged version of Hugh Kitson's wonderful documentary called Whose Land? And it's actually got a question mark at the end of it, after which our guests will be invited to share some thoughts on the current situation over there. We'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience, but we're going to keep everybody muted until then to prevent any unwanted sounds that can be very distracting if people's microphones remain on. The chat function is available for general comments as usual, so feel free to send messages to the audience during the discussion. For those who are not sure how to use this, there is a chat icon in the middle of the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and that will open up the chat window, and you just enter your comments in that little box at the bottom of that panel. Now, to begin proceedings tonight, I would like to ask David Adler, President of the Australian Jewish Association, to introduce our guests.
Thank you very much, Alan. I do want to make the observation that a couple of people have already picked up on the terminology yes. of annexation, the sovereignty, and I'm with the sovereignty group. I think that's an important principle. And let me just state AJA policy very clearly. We support the principle of Israel sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. I believe we're the only Jewish organisation in this country that are prepared to make that statement clearly and publicly. We do also recognise that in terms of implementation, this is entirely a decision for the Israeli government, and it is inappropriate for external parties to seek to interfere. So that's a summary of our position. I'm actually going to go straight to the movie, and then I'll introduce the guests one by one and invite them to make a statement. So hopefully this will work.
Perfect.
هاي تل الربيع شوف طنطس الصارت تل الربيع.
هاي أرض الميعاد، هم بفكروا اليهود إنها ميعاد لهم، لكن هي ميعاد لتجميعهم للقضاء عليهم بأمر رب العباد.
لقد بنيت خطتي على نار الحقد والكراهية التي تملأ قلوب اليهود نحو محمد وأتباعه، على ضياع هيبتنا بسبب محمد.
Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's architect of the campaign to brand the Jewish people as a subhuman race in Nazi Germany, was quoted as saying, "A similar tactic is being used today in the propaganda war waged against Israel by Islam and the pro-Palestinian factions in the Middle East."
لكن نحن في مدارسنا نعلم ما يوليه علينا ديننا وضميرنا، لأن القدس هي عربية، وأن فلسطين من شمالها لجنوبها من نهرها لبحرها هي عربية فلسطينية إسلامية، وستبقى كذلك رغم أنف هذا المحتل الآن.
At the heart of the propaganda war against Israel is the use of fake history and lawfare, the revision and deliberate misrepresentation of international law. Whose Land is a documentary film looking at the legitimacy of Israel in international law, with a highly qualified group of historians and international lawyers.
San Remo, the Villa de Vachon. This is a place where legal rights were given to both the Jewish people and the Arab people. It was the Jewish people that were chosen to be the beneficiaries of a trust, a mandate under the care of the British government in respect to Palestine.
San Remo basically adopted the content of the Balfour Declaration, and it was approved by 51 countries, which was then the international community.
Relies on the San Remo Conference. That is the basis. That's not been changed.
The San Remo Resolution of 1920, its unanimous endorsement by the League of Nations, and the mandate document which incorporated the Balfour Declaration is binding under international law to this day.
In formulating legally binding instruments, there was a recognition of the cultural, historic roots of the Jewish people in that land.
You see, they are recognizing a pre-existing right and not creating a new right. In other words, the historical rights of the Jewish people to this land were recognized by the UN at the time.
Which means that if they can establish that they had a vibrant community in Jerusalem, or in Hebron, or in Shiloh, and in different areas of the Holy Land, they've been given the right to reconstitute these communities.
Article 80 of the UN Charter assumes the powers that were given to the League of Nations. So anything such as the San Remo Resolution, such as the Mandate for Palestine, are still legally binding under the UN Charter.
It becomes part of international law.
At the same time, we will reveal that the Palestinian claim to any part of the land has no historical basis at all.
Of course, there was no Palestinian nation. Salah ad-Din, neither Dar el-Omar had in mind building an Arab-Palestinian nation as they write today in their history.
Nobody had any thoughts of Palestinian nationalism at that time, whatever, because there was no such place as a state of Palestine, and never had been. So nobody had gone for generations thinking, I'm a Palestinian.
So the name Palestine after 1948 was kind of adopted by the non-Jewish Palestinians, and they say, we are the true Palestinians. We belong in the land. We are the indigenous people. And these Jews came to create this thing called Israel.
Palestinian Authority tells their people that the Jewish people did not have a history in the land of Israel. And this is one of their fundamental principles of their ideology. And therefore they claim that there never was a Jewish presence in Jerusalem.
An UNESCO resolution that basically says that Jews and Israel do not have any connection to Jews and the temple is something that should stay in history as the biggest lie.
Whose land does not set out to justify the right of Israel to exist. Instead, it simply tells the truth.
The attempt of the modern Palestinians to say, oh, we go back to antiquity.
Media coverage of the Middle East and even United Nations resolutions use terminology such as occupied Palestinian territory and the illegal occupation. Is this terminology based on international law, or is it simply anti-Israel propaganda?
The term Palestinian territories, or occupied Palestinian territories, or OPT, which is used in virtually every General Assembly resolution in the UN, this expression...
Arab rejection of Resolution 181 precludes the Arabs from any legal claim they might otherwise have to that territory.
Jordan, Syria, Egypt had no claim to Jerusalem or the West Bank on the basis of any doctrinal principle of international law.
And so the Jewish settlements and the claim for Israel to exercise jurisdiction over the West Bank, I think, is legally supported, certainly by Article 80 of the UN Charter.
Will the two-state solution really bring peace to the Middle East?
The Palestinian Authority, through the frameworks that it controls, television, Ministry of Education, goes out of its way to tell its children that Israelis can never be peace partners, because the problem is not land and the problem is not Israel. The problem is our essence as Jews.
أعداء الله أبناء الخنازير وقطعوا أسلاءهم بالحجارة والسكاكين ودنسوا كتاب الله على الملايين. أين أمة الإسلام والمجاهدين؟ أين مخافة الله في القدس قد دنست بالصهايين.
I don't think that there is an interest of the Palestinian leader to solve the conflict.
نحيي كل ذرة دم أريقت في سبيل القدس، فهي دماء نظيفة، دماء نقية، دماء في سبيل الله إن شاء الله، وكل شهيد سيكون في الجنة وكل جريح سيكتب له الله الثواب. هذا الأقصى لنا والقيامة لنا، كلها لنا، لا يحق لهم أن يدنسوها.
Oslo can be considered as that tragedy for the Palestinian people. In my opinion, the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian leadership are not acting since the Oslo Agreement until today as a leadership.
What Israel has had to do is effectively just give. And we've seen this for so long now that it seems to me to be an obvious part of Palestinian diplomacy. They just take.
A state need to be built before it's recognized. And unfortunately, I didn't see neither the Palestinian Authority nor the international community are trying to build a Palestinian state.
The idea that you can make out of a state two completely different entities which are hostile to one another, where the president of one of them hasn't actually been elected, his term of office ended years ago, where the other one is an actual terrorist organisation, which is still firing rockets into its neighbour. That is not the kind of state that the United Nations should want amongst its members.
Join me, Richard Kemp, in the two-part documentary film Whose Land, as we uncover the true story behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Okay, well, there's our short taste of the movie, and it seems logical that the first person who should be introduced to make some comments about it is indeed the producer of the movie, Hugh Kitson. Now, I don't want to give any lengthy introductions. I think his work speaks for himself. Hugh is a documentary filmmaker and has had 40 years experience in films and television. And there are a few other versions of this. We have the 45-minute version, which is going live this evening on the AJA YouTube channel if you want to see it in more detail. And Hugh has a website which is simply called whoseland.tv, where you can purchase the complete movie either on DVD or for a very small amount, you can view it online. So over to you, Hugh, to make some comments about the issue, why you made the movie Whose Land.
Well, I guess that one of the reasons, or the main reason why we made Whose Land is simply because of the lies that are told about Israel. very sadly, our Prime Minister here in the UK is objecting to Israel extending civil law in Judea and Samaria on the basis that it's a violation of international law. And that is absolutely not the case. What you're putting up on your website is part one of Whose Land, which actually looks at the legal foundations of the State of Israel enshrined in the San Remo Resolution and then in the British Mandate for Palestine. And the specific purpose of the Mandate for Palestine was to establish a Jewish homeland in historic Israel. And so the legal rights of the Jewish state to exist today, actually, I believe in all of the land, is enshrined in the Mandate. And there's also another legal doctrine that is very relevant today, and that is one called uti possidetis juris, which I'm going to leave to Andrew to explain that, other than to say that basically, and this is a universal doctrine in international law, that when a state is born, and Israel was the only state to be established in 1948, it inherits the borders of the previous highest authority. But maybe Andrew might want to say a little bit more about that. The unfortunate thing is that all the detractors of Israel, they start the clock ticking in 1967, and what happened before 1967 is completely ignored. There are two things I'd like to say, and this is dealt with in part one, which is going up on your website tonight. And that is that Britain actually violated her obligations, her legal obligations under the Mandate on almost every single level. And that has had the effect of turning Israel's legal rights on its head in perception, not in reality, but in perception. And that is very important to actually say that. The other thing is that part two, which we have yet to complete, and the reason we haven't completed it to date is lack of finance to do so. We begin part two with looking at the War of Independence in 1948. Now, under the UN Charter, an invasion to seize territory is illegal. In fact, it was more than just to seize territory. It was to wipe out the newborn state of Israel altogether. That was the point of it. And of course, they lost that war, but Jordan's subsequent annexation of what they renamed as the West Bank is illegal in international law. There's no question about that. The unfortunate thing is, from Britain's point of view, is that we militarily backed that invasion. So arguably, we were in breach ourselves of Article 2 of the UN Charter in assisting Jordan. In fact, we not only assisted them, we basically led them into war, because their commanding officer, Sir John Bagot Glubb, otherwise known as Glubb Pasha, was a serving British Army general. And he must have had some relationship with Whitehall and probably been under the orders of Whitehall. So Britain actually, I believe, was in breach of the UN Charter in 1948. And I do believe that there has been a massive cover-up by the British government, whether it's the Foreign Office or the government itself, in the fact that we have actually breached international law ourselves on a massive scale. And I'm afraid to say that Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, he can't on the one hand say that Britain is a close friend of Israel and at the same time enunciate a policy that he's recently done in decrying the fact that actually what the Israeli government want to do is to reclaim sovereignty that they were given in the first place. So basically, this is why we've made Whose Land. The other thing I will say as well, that Newt Gingrich, who was, I think he was Speaker of the House of Representatives in Congress, probably 25 years ago, he made this comment. He said that the Palestinians are an invented people. Well, in terms of their identity and their history, they're certainly an invented people. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that now they are a real people and they are entitled to self-determination. And in fact, they were given self-determination under Oslo, and all they've done is squander that. So I'll hand back to you.
Okay, look, thank you very much. We're going to give each of our guests an opportunity to make a few opening remarks like that, and then they'll come together as a panel, and Alan Friedman and Ted Lapkin will put them through the ringer with some hard questions, hopefully. Hugh was introducing some legal concepts, so it makes sense to jump to Andrew Tucker, who's an expert in international law. Andrew was born and raised in Australia. He's worked in the UK and Netherlands, where he joins us tonight. He's practiced for 20 years or so, and he's been involved in some of the really top legal think tanks on international law. So, Andrew, we welcome your comments and responses to the legal issues that Hugh's raised.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, David. Good evening, everybody. It's nice to be with you. I think one of the challenges that we face is that the whole idea of international law has changed over time. So in effect, what's happening is the international community is changing the rules as we go along. And Hugh is absolutely right, and I think that's one of the great things about this film, is to go back in time 100 years and to think about, well, where did this state of Israel come from? Why is it that the Jewish people are there, and what is their position under international law? And we must go back to those original documents of San Remo and the Mandate, because they did indeed lay the foundations for the state of Israel in 1948, and I believe they have a very strong position under international law. The challenge, I think, is, however, that since 1945, since the Second World War, international law has completely changed. So you have a number of really important developments which I think are causing the international community now to say that Israel, the Jewish people, have no rights whatsoever in the West Bank. And one of them is this principle of the non-acquisition of territory by force. So it's a foundational principle of the UN Charter. You cannot acquire territory by force. This is the main argument that's used to say that what Israel is proposing to do is illegal. And I'll come back to that in a moment. You have a whole range of human rights law. You have international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. And you have the United Nations itself, which is a political institution. But with all of that together, I think 99% of the international legal community are not so interested anymore in what happened 100 years ago. They're interested in the international institutions. They're interested in whether the UN can solve the problems of the world. And countries like Israel and the United States, who are claiming exceptionalism, they're claiming their sovereign rights, they're perceived to be outside the norm, they're outside the consensus. And that is challenging, I think, the philosophy, the ideology of most international lawyers today, because they see the answer to the world's problems is the international institution, the international courts in The Hague, the UN in the United Nations, in New York and in Geneva. And anybody that challenges them is seen to be challenging the international legal order. So in my view, what we have is a clash of paradigms. It's a clash, I think, between those who argue for state sovereignty and who argue for statehood, and those who are, let's say, of a globalist perspective and who are not so interested anymore in the sovereignty of states. In fact, they challenge even whether we should have states anymore and whether we should talk about sovereignty. It's a general ideology which I think is undermining states like Israel. So that's a general context, I think, within which we're arguing. And I think it challenges Australia, for example, the government of Australia, to stand up and to argue the case for the state of Israel, because states are important and government is important and governance is important. And the Palestinians have indeed failed to create institutions. They've failed to create a state. And in fact, I think they're unable to do that. It's a fundamental principle that I think Australia and countries like Australia should be arguing for, because these principles are important. Now, one of the problems as well is that since 1967, Israel itself has not clearly put its position in the international community. So it's taken a kind of pragmatic view. They claimed effectively sovereignty over East Jerusalem by applying Israeli law to East Jerusalem immediately after the Six-Day War. Now, that has never been accepted by the international community. But as far as the rest of Judea and Samaria is concerned, the West Bank, they've taken this kind of ambiguous position that they don't quite claim sovereignty. They don't abandon their sovereign rights, but they're not claiming it. And instead, they've entered into this discourse of occupation and applying a military administration. And that's created, in my view, a vacuum, a legal vacuum that the Palestinians and the pro-Palestinian world, and particularly the Arab world, have gladly filled. And they've filled it by claiming Palestinian statehood, to the point that today the Palestinians have been able to go to the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and say, we are a state, because the international community has recognized us. And which is absurd, because they're nothing like a state. They don't have the institutions of statehood. They have the external trappings, but none of the internal realities of statehood. But nevertheless, the politics of it, they've been able to twist the political institutions. And I think it's partly because Israel itself has not clearly put its view. And I think that's because there's a lot of division within the Jewish community in Israel and outside Israel about whether or not Israel has a right to be in the West Bank. So that is making it problematic, I think, both for the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community outside Israel to be putting the case, if Israel itself is not putting its own case very clearly. Notwithstanding that, I think the case is there. I think it can be put. The film argues very well, I think, about San Remo and the mandate. I will mention very quickly this principle of uti possidetis juris that Hugh has mentioned. I think it's a very strong argument, and that is quite simply that any state that emerges out of a mandate or a trust or a colony, for that matter, assumes the territorial administrative boundaries of the mandate as the borders of that state. So half the states in the world, their borders have been determined on the basis of this principle. And in fact, the borders of Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and Jordan, they owe their borders to this principle. And therefore, it should apply equally to Israel. And that means that when Israel was born in May 1948, it took on the borders of the Mandate for Palestine, which at that time was everything west of the Jordan River. That's a very clear principle, and I think it's a very strong one that we should be putting. And the law of occupation doesn't undermine that. Even if Israel is an occupying power, which is arguable, it doesn't mean that the occupying power can have no sovereignty. An occupying power does not lose its sovereignty simply because it is in a situation of occupation. There's nothing about the law of occupation which denies Israel's sovereign claims. And again, I think Israel needs to be putting those sovereign claims very clearly. Perhaps a third point, two more short points, and I'll wrap up. But one is, yes, the Palestinians have a right to self-determination, but that right to self-determination is not a right to statehood. And it's also not a right to sovereignty over territory. There are many other peoples in the world that claim self-determination, but you do not have a right to statehood. The only way that a state of Palestine could ever emerge is through negotiation with Israel. That's because Israel is a sovereign state. And effectively what the Palestinians are trying to do is to secede from the state of Israel. And they can only do that if Israel agrees to that happening. And then a final point, I think, is the Oslo Accords. I think by entering into the Oslo Accords, Israel has put itself, I believe, in a difficult position. It's bound by the Oslo Accords in principle. But those Oslo Accords, they're complex agreements. And ever since 1993, the Palestinians have been breaching those agreements themselves. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is Israel's partner. And it's the PLO which denies continually Israel's sovereignty, even in its own territory. The PLO to this very day denies the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. So there comes a point, I think, where Israel is entitled to say that the Palestinians are breaching these agreements so fundamentally, in such a fundamental way, that the agreements themselves allow Israel to take a unilateral step. So I'm not entirely in favor of applying sovereignty to bits and pieces of the West Bank. I'm not sure this is really the right way of doing it. But I do think that Israel has a right to claim sovereignty over the territories of the West Bank. And I think there's a good legal case to be put. It's not an easy one in this political climate, but I think the arguments are there, and I think they're very strong arguments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And last but certainly not least, Colonel Richard Kemp, who needs very little introduction. He's been a champion not only on the battlefield, but now in the political field, having spoken vigorously at the United Nations and in the media. So Richard, invite you to make some comments, and perhaps we haven't yet touched upon the special security overlay that applies to the Israel-Palestinian Arab interface, and maybe you can comment on that as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, David. And like both of my other co-panelists, I also have a connection with Australia in as much as I'm a quarter Australian, my great-grandparents having come from Rockhampton. So it's a real pleasure to be joining you virtually, unfortunately, tonight. And I only wish I could be in Australia for real, but hopefully before too much longer, I'll be able to come back and enjoy your wonderful country. I just want to mention a few issues in relation to this situation. First of all, I would strongly applaud the AJA's stance on this particular issue that we're discussing today. And I've spoken to many Jewish organizations here in the UK, in the United States and elsewhere, and I've been quite surprised and somewhat disappointed at the lack of support and the deep concern that so many of them feel about Israel's proposals. And I think it really behoves us to recognize that Israel as a sovereign state is entitled to take the action it thinks it should be taking within international law. I disagree with our Prime Minister's perspective, which Hugh Kitson mentioned, which is to say that he's a great friend of Israel, but he disagrees and he thinks Israel's proposals are illegal. And of course, Britain and Israel, both of us, as well as New Zealand, have specific interests and responsibilities in relation to Israel. And those, I think, stem predominantly in historical terms right the way back to the actions that we took, which really were fundamental to the re-establishment of the State of Israel. I'm talking about the Palestine campaign that ended in 1918, when British, Australian, New Zealand troops throughout the Ottoman Empire and established what eventually became the Mandate for Palestine. Now, if that hadn't happened, I don't think there could be any State of Israel today. You know, what's to say the Turks or the Ottomans, in whatever form they evolved into, would not have remained in control of that land. So that's a sort of historical context for I think our responsibilities, as well as just decent human beings who should be supporting, I think, this kind of lawful action that Israel's planning to take. I think there are three major benefits for the proposals that are being made. And one of the first ones, which you sort of touched on, David, is security, the security issue. Israel, as a sovereign state, deserves to be able to secure its borders and secure its people. And it lives in an environment, in a region of the world, which is extremely dangerous, far more dangerous than the rest of us live in. And is constantly changing, constantly subject to aggression by individual countries or individual groups within those countries. And therefore, its needs for security are probably greater than most of us. And one issue that I think is very important is the need for Israel to take full, permanent, legitimate control of the Jordan Valley. That is fundamental to Israel's security. Without it, without control of that area, Israel as a state is under great threat. And if you think about what's happening on the Jordan Valley, you won't find Jordanian troops facing Israel, looking at Israel, looking across the border and looking to defend themselves against Israel, because they know that Israel is not a hostile country. You'll find Jordanian troops facing the other way, facing into their own country, in effect, protecting Israel or helping to protect Israel, because they recognize that that's where the hostility comes from. They also recognize, the Jordanians, that the last thing they need is an unruly, maverick state across the river. And so I think, although they may say things differently in public, I think the reality is that the Jordanian leadership, in common with many other Arab leaders in Middle East, support the plans that are being put forward. They have to say different things publicly and to their own people, but the reality is you won't find significant dissent from these proposals from the Arab countries. And this new proposal, the US peace proposals that this sovereignty issue is part of, are unique in history, because it's the first time ever in history that a peace plan has been put forward on the Israel-Palestinian situation, which Israel can agree to, Israel can agree at least to negotiate on the basis of it, and the Arab countries do not object to, do not strenuously object to. And that's the first time that's ever happened, going right the way back to 1937 and the Peel Commission, which was, of course, the first time that the Arabs completely rejected the idea of any form of two-state solution. And we've seen their rejection coming the right way forward in history. The other, I think, another key point on this whole business is that Israel should also be able to extend its laws onto its communities in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. Because up until now, due, I think, mainly to convenience, the law there has been military law, and it's not right. In the long term, it's not right that civilians should be long-term subject to military law. And so that's an important issue, and their legitimacy and their presence in these areas should be formalized and stabilized. And I think sovereignty brings that to the Jewish people in those areas. By the way, it also brings great advantages to the Arab people living in Judea and Samaria. It effectively, the proposals which this sovereignty plan is part of, the proposals offer the Arabs, the Palestinians, their own state. They offer them their own state, actually with 50% more territory than they currently control, when you include other territory that's being proposed adjacent to Egypt for part of the Palestinian state. It gives free movement for all peoples within their own national areas. And it gives an opportunity that the Arabs have not yet so far really had. And I think this, you know, what a lot of people say about what they call annexation, which David quite rightly says is not annexation. You cannot annex an area that you already possess and that's already legally yours, which I would argue this whole territory is. The people that argue against the so-called annexation argue that it spells the end of the two-state solution, and people in Britain over here say the same thing in many cases. Well, it's not the case at all, because one of the prerequisites that the United States have laid down in order to recognize Israel's proposal for implementing sovereignty in areas of Judea and Samaria, the main populated areas populated by the Jewish people, is that the Prime Minister of Israel undertakes to work towards the creation of a Palestinian state as well. So it's really the opposite of what's being suggested. The third point, really, I think, that I wanted to make before I finish is to say that this does give the best opportunity, I think, that the Palestinians have had for peace, stability, and prosperity in this area. As I mentioned, they've rejected every time that the idea of a two-state solution, of them having their own state in effect, every time it's come up, it's been rejected by them, been utterly rejected since 1937, right up until the current Trump peace proposals. And the reason for that is because there's a sort of bizarre belief among peace processors that you can try the same thing over and over and over again and get a different result. And it's the definition, I don't know who said it, but somebody said that is the definition of insanity, which I think is true. Now this right, okay, that famous Australian. This takes a different approach, because for the first time it denies the Palestinians the opportunity to veto progress. Up until now they vetoed progress. Now they don't have a veto on progress, because Israel can make this move without the Palestinians saying no. Just in conclusion then, the current state of play, as I understand it, is that the Prime Minister said he would implement sovereignty not before the 1st of July. It wasn't on the 1st or by the 1st of July, it was not before the 1st of July. And my understanding is that there's been some negotiations which may still be ongoing between the Americans and the Israelis to determine exactly what form that implementation will take before the Americans will recognize it. There's also clearly negotiations going on in earnest with Arab countries to allay their concerns and to see what can be done to maximize their cooperation. And of course, there's been negotiation happening within Israel itself. And you know, there's obviously different perspectives from the coalition, the leaders of the different factions of the coalition that are going to have to come to a conclusion on this. But I think if the reality is, if Israel does not take these steps now, and I mean, when I say now, I mean very soon, there's a good chance it isn't going to happen, because it's got to happen quite early before the US election, because if it doesn't, the potential turbulence and fallout, which I don't believe is going to be great, by the way, in the Middle East, but the potential turbulence could impact on the election from an electoral calculation point of view, and therefore the current US administration will want it done sooner rather than later. And the second thing is, if President Trump does not win the election in November, then it's very unlikely this will ever come about, or certainly not in the foreseeable future, because I very much doubt a Democrat administration would accept this. I think if it's acted upon and Israel implement their sovereignty before an election which was won by the Democrats, I don't think the Democrats are likely to reverse that. And for example, I think Joe Biden has already said that he will not attempt to reverse America's current policy on Jerusalem, having the embassy there, etc. And I suspect the same might be true of this. But I think the situation is so complex, with other issues going on in Israel now, with coronavirus taking off again there, unfortunately, with the events in Iran recently, which all have an impact on Israeli political life. We will have to wait and see. And in my estimation, we will have to hope that this happens sooner rather than later, because I do think it's the best chance for Israeli and Palestinian peace, security, and prosperity.
Okay. Thank you so much, Richard. And we'll probably go a little over 9 o'clock, but I'll hand now to Alan and Ted to ask some questions and manage question time.
Okay, thanks, David. So just a reminder, if anybody would like to ask a question, please raise your hand electronically. And the way to do that is click on the button at the bottom which says reactions, and just click one of the hands, and then we'll see it and we'll call on you to ask your questions. Please keep your questions brief and avoid long statements as usual. There's a couple of hands up. I can see Anthony. We'll come to you in a moment, Anthony. But well, rank has its privileges, so I'm going to give Ted the opportunity to ask the first question. So it's over to you, Ted.
Yeah, thank you. This question is to Andrew Tucker, given the fact that he resides in The Hague, the scene of the crime, so to speak, in terms of this outrageous prosecution in the ICC. And The Hague is a small town, so I'm sure that when he's out and about, he has his fingers on the vibe of what's going on. And so my question is, given the fact that the Trump administration has said that it will impose individual sanctions on ICC officials if this absurd prosecution of Israel continues. I mean, the main focus is of course United States personnel, but they kind of nicely tucked Israel into that statement indirectly. So I guess, what can you tell me about the thinking of officials at the courts? What is the local goss? I mean, are they worried that they won't be able to take their kids to Disneyland or vacation on Martha's Vineyard? They won't be able to get into Harvard because basically, my understanding is the sanctions are imposed on them and their families. And one of those sanctions is they will not be able to enter the United States. So, I mean, what's the vibe? Are they nervous?
Okay, so just so everybody knows what's going on, the International Criminal Court, which was set up 20 years ago to prosecute the most heinous international war crimes and crimes against humanity. It's International Court. Israel is not a party to the ICC, to the Rome Statute. Israel realized that the ICC would become a political institution, which it has. The ICC has been a failure. Basically, it has, I think, four successful prosecutions to its credit, and has cost billions and billions of dollars. The court is under a lot of criticism, and they're looking for a win. They're looking for an easy victory, and I think Israel is an easy victory for them. They're under a lot of pressure to move forward with an investigation of Israeli war crimes. And it's basically the settlements that they're going after. They want to prosecute Netanyahu, Gantz, other Israeli leaders for allowing settlements to have been built. And the prosecutor is, the only way they can do that is if they can decide that Palestine is a state, because then the crimes would have been committed on this territory of a state that is a state party. And Palestine the state of Palestine has acceded to the ICC Treaty of Rome. Now, it's absurd because everybody knows Palestine's not a state. But this court, and it's a court of three that have to make a decision, and they'll make it any day now. It's a Hungarian, a Frenchman, and an African lawyer on this three-panel court, pre-trial chamber. And I think the general expectation is they're not worried about the sanctions. They are going to find a way, probably, for the court to be able to move forward, give the prosecutor green light to investigate. And I think it's the political pressure behind the scenes. Yes, they might be concerned personally about their own lack of freedom to move to the US, but the bigger pressure that's on them is from the Arab world, it's from Europe, it's from the vast majority of nations who want to see Israeli leaders prosecuted.
So in that respect, do you think it would be useful if there were voices, for example, in the Australian Parliament who mooted the question, brought up the question maybe in a private member's motion or in a parliamentary debate about Australia withdrawing from the Vienna Convention?
Listen, I think it would be very good. Australia was one of only 7 countries that made a submission to the court in these proceedings, and it's very good that Australia did so. There was a lot of lobbying behind the scenes to get Australia to do it. But together with Austria, Germany, Brazil, Uganda, Hungary, maybe 1 or 2 other countries, Australia said, we do not believe Palestine is a state. And until Palestine has in fact become a state, the court does not have the jurisdiction to do this. So I think everything should be done to support the statement that Australia has already made. And that if the court goes forward, then Australia, yes, should definitely be taking political action within the ICC state parties to withdraw from the Statute of Rome, which is the statute that set up.
Statute of Rome, not Statute of Vienna, sorry.
Yeah,
the argument being it could come back in the future and they could go after jiggers. They could go after Australian soldiers at some point.
Yeah, well, that's right. And they're now going after the UK for potential war crimes as well. So I think every freedom-loving country that has an army in war zone areas is going to be subject to ICC prosecution. And this is deeply problematic.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Now we'll take some audience questions. The first one with his hand up was Anthony Cohen. I've just unmuted you, Anthony. So fire away, please ask your question.
Thank you. My question is also to Andrew. Surely one of the most powerful arguments for Israel attaining sovereignty and destroying the Palestinian argument is that from 1948 to 1967, the Gaza Strip was part of Jordan, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem was part of Egypt, I mean, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem were part of Jordan. And in no stage did either of those countries or the Arab League, which originally took the argument to the UN, did they proclaim a Palestinian statehood or a Palestinian entity even in those areas. Now, if the Arab League and the Arab countries involved could not agree to Palestinian self-determination in those areas, it hardly behoves Israel to do what they couldn't do to their own people.
Thank you, Anthony. That's a very good question, a good point. I think what the Palestinians say is that they've been given a bum deal by Jordan and the Arab world as well. And I think that the appeal that they make to the international community, and this is what the prosecutor argues in the ICC as well, she says, well, you can't have a territory where nobody is sovereign. So if Israel's not claiming clear sovereignty, the Palestinian people, whether or not they existed prior to 1967 or not, but they are the people of the West Bank, and peoples have a right to sovereignty. Now, it's not a very good legal case because peoples don't have a right to sovereignty under international law, but it's an emotional appeal, which I think for many is very appealing. And that is, you know, this people, they've been there for millennia. They deserve to have autonomy. They deserve to have a state. Israel doesn't have a clear sovereign claim, is what people think. Therefore, this people should fill that vacuum. So, you know, I think the strongest claim is not so much what Jordan did or didn't do, or the fact that the PLO was only set up later. I think the strongest claim is that Israel acquired sovereignty in 1948 as a matter of law. Now, how they've exercised it is a secondary issue. But as a matter of law, Israel, as a sovereign state, acquired sovereignty over the West Bank because that's what happens when mandates finish. And then you could have an argument about the balancing of rights and interests, but the starting point is, I think, the legal situation in May 1948.
Okay, next question is from Matt Gelman. Matt, you'll need to unmute yourself and ask your question.
We need to unmute him.
On my screen it says ask him to unmute himself.
Now we have. Okay.
Now we're right. No, hang on. No, you do it, David. Sorry, I've just reversed you.
Okay, Matt, you're on.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Alan, and thank you to the distinguished also speakers and their English speakers are reminiscent of the great friendship and support from other historical figures such as Wingate and Churchill. Even Lord Palmerston was a great Zionist in the 19th century. Talking of Zionism, there was the mention
Matt,
of the...
You need to ask a question, not a speech, a question.
Sorry, David, but I'm just leading to that. My question is in terms of the sort of motivation and the thinking in terms of the perspective of the Jewish people's right to the land of Israel as being God-given, as it being a promised land, and how that motivates the speakers such as Colonel Kemp and others in their support of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel.
So what exactly is your question, Matt? Do you want to just repeat that?
He wants to know whether there's a biblical influence in the thinking of the speakers.
Well, most definitely, from my point of view, most definitely.
Okay.
Shall I say something?
Yes,
please.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just to sort of add slightly to what what Andrew mentioned in relation to Anthony's question just now. The other point to be aware of about Palestinian leadership desires is that the Palestinian National Council, which was the Arab sort of representative body after 1948, they explicitly excluded Judea and Samaria and Gaza from their desire for a state. They saw the rest of Israel as theirs. That was their claim. Judea and Samaria and Gaza, they explicitly excluded that from their claim. It was only after Israel retook those areas in '67 that they suddenly became their national homeland. In relation to the question that Matt asked, and he mentioned Ord Wingate and a few others. Lloyd George, I think, is another one who could be deemed to be a very strong Zionist. I think they were both, and some of the other British Zionists were motivated by religion, and Ord Wingate certainly was. I suspect he may have known even more about Judaism than most of you here, even though he wasn't a Jew. I have to say I'm not. I am a Christian, and I have the utmost respect for Judaism, but my motivation in supporting Israel and Israel's rights is not a religious one. I don't have any conflict or problem with that, but that is not my reason. My reason is much more in terms of what's right and what's wrong, which obviously itself derives from religion, but and political. So it's, you know, some people like Pastor Hagee in America and people like Ord Wingate would describe themselves as Christian Zionists. I am both a Christian and a Zionist, but I don't consider myself a Christian Zionist in as much as that's my main motivation. And I think I have to say that although, you know, I'm sure we wouldn't disagree on the religious authority for Israel's right to exist and have a homeland in the promised land, we wouldn't disagree with that. But I think in this world today, it's not a strong argument to convince and persuade people who don't already hold that. So I don't tend to use the religious justification when I'm arguing on this issue.
Thanks, Richard. Just as a corollary to that, we have a question on the chat. Do you recognise that this conflict is in fact a religious conflict?
Can I just say something about that one?
Jump in, Andrew.
Yeah. Look, I think at its deepest, it is a religious conflict in the sense that clearly the Palestinian Liberation Organization and obviously the more extreme Palestinian liberation movements, including Hamas, are religiously driven. So the Palestinians have always also said that, you know, if and when a Palestinian state comes into existence, it will be under Islamic law. These are Islamic lands. Now, they're not always clear in that, but that's, you just have to read the Palestinian National Charter and you can see that. So I think to a large extent, yes, it is definitely a religious conflict. If I could just come back to the previous questions for my 2 cents worth, I mean, for me as an international lawyer, I think there's, you know, 3 driving reasons for wanting to support Israel in this. One is just the basic sense of the justice of the Jewish case and the history of the Jewish people and their inherent connection with the land. And I think the rightness of their ability and right to have their own homeland amongst the nations in the land in which they were born. Secondly, I believe very much in historical truth and fighting for historical truth. And I think, yes, that comes from a Christian conviction, but it should equally apply to anybody. And thirdly, for me as a lawyer, I'm fighting for the right use and application of international law, because I believe international law is being twisted and misrepresented and misused in all of this. And I'm concerned about the direction that international law is going and the way that the institutions are using international law. So there's very much also, I think, a battle for the international legal system itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Our next question is from Kim Farnick in Adelaide. So David, will you please unmute Kim and then the question can be asked.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Very practical question. What actions can we take to lobby, to inform and to basically give our government a push in the right direction? My wife and I have been active in that area, and it's I kind of already know the answer, but I'm rather putting it out there to sort of encourage a discussion around that.
Can I deal with that as basically the local lobbyist? I think that one of the most important issues, again, is the ICC case, because if Andrew's prognostications are accurate and they proceed with the case, you could end up with a situation where any former Israeli military official, and you're looking at one, could be subject to an international arrest warrant. So if Andrew's prognostication or prediction turns out to be true, then I think that one of the things we need to organize is a political pressure campaign to advocate with the Australian government on behalf of Australia's withdrawal from the Rome Treaty, from the ICC. That would be one thing.
Anybody else have any comments? No? Okay. We've gone a bit over time. We'll take one more question. Jeff Seidner. Jeff, please give us a 15-second question. And,
I'll give it to you in 10 seconds. Every generation to come and get us, dodge with the various phrases from Zionism is racism to unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. Don't you think we should create a website which absolutely debunks those hundreds and hundreds of debunkable things that are never have an opportunity of being debunked in any other forum except through a website? That was 15 seconds or less.
Well done. Anybody like to comment on that?
We should make a website.
I think the answer.
Okay.
Well,
I have a question kind of more on point for Richard. Grunt to grunt, infantryman to infantryman. There are those who say that in the 21st, they were saying this in the 20th century, that in the era of air power, terrain and tactical terrain considerations are not important. So how would you counter, I mean, I know the answer, but just for the sake of the audience, how would you counter someone who comes along and says, look, this is the era of intercontinental ballistic missiles, air power, unmanned aerial vehicles that can be used to fire missiles. So it really doesn't matter in terms of the terrain and the Jordan River as Israel's eastern security border. That military technology has basically superseded that consideration.
That's a good question. I think there are many different points to discuss, but I'll try and be as brief as I can. I mean, under President Obama's proposals for peace in the Middle East, General John Allen, who was a United States Marine Corps general, very well respected, came up with a proposal which he placed a huge amount of emphasis on military technology to protect Israel in the event that the IDF withdrew from Judea and Samaria, which was what was being advocated. The reality is that all of that stuff is very good and very useful, but it will not stand alone, even in the modern era. And he also recommended, despite his reliance on technology, he recommended the deployment of US forces into that area when the IDF withdrew, which again, for reasons I won't go into now, is completely a ridiculous proposal. But I think the fact is that technology takes you so far. It may be sometime in the future that we have technology that does allow ground to be held without the presence of infantry forces on the ground and other forces as well on the ground. But right now it doesn't work, and there are various reasons for that. One of which is that we know only too well what happens when a country such as Israel withdraws from hostile territory. We saw that in Gaza, and we saw the results of it. Now, their technology does not allow them to defend their country from hostility from Gaza without sometimes having to go in and deal with it on the ground. And of course, every time that happens, and when they do defend themselves with a military incursion or airstrikes, then there is global condemnation against that. The same applies in southern Lebanon. We know how many thousands of missiles are facing Israel from southern Lebanon. One day, when Iran decides to use those missiles against Israel, Israel will have to go in there again and will cause massive civilian death, despite their best wishes not to. So we just have realistic examples on the ground today on two sides of Israel, which show that this the technology argument just doesn't work. And it's not even as if you could say, well, there'll be Palestinian security forces in there who will deal with this. Well, there might be, but they will not be a proper army. That's part of the terms of any proposal for a Palestinian state. They're not having an offensive military capability, but also they, any future Palestinian state in that area is going to be a weak state anyway. Come what may, it's going to be weak for the foreseeable future. And what is to stop some other entity, whether it be Iran, which is most likely, whether it be an Islamic State successor entity, from taking over the terrain or part of the terrain and using it to attack Israel from? And then when Israel has to go in there and deal with it, then there's going to be many more casualties. So I think the only way today really to secure terrain of that nature is to have a permanent military presence as well as technology backing it up.
Thanks very much, Richard. We're going to wrap it up now. As usual, what we do is formally close the session. If anybody wants to hang around and have a chat, then you're welcome to do that. Just before I ask Ted to pass a vote of thanks to our fantastic panel, I will mention that Andrew has written a book on this subject, and I had the pleasure of interviewing him a couple of years ago. So Andrew, just if people are interested, just tell everybody the title of your book and where it's available.
The book is called Israel on Trial, and we have a website called Think. Our organisation is called Think, THINC.info. I'll pop it in the chat, and you can find it on the website. Israel on Trial is a bit of a thick book, but it tells the whole story about the legal story about the creation of the State of Israel and its current status and the position within the UN. So it's also a story about the United Nations.
Yep, it's an excellent
book. I've got a copy of it
that's it.
Here, and I've read it. It's an excellent book. I'm learning about international law. Alan, if I may just say something very quickly. We're in a battle for the truth, and that is what Whose Land is aiming to get across, is the truth. And we need people's support for it. Thank you.
Okay. Well done. Now, Ted, would you just like to give a brief vote of thanks to our guests?
Yes, indeed. It's been a privilege. We basically had this evening a trifecta. We've had the military, we've had the legal, and we've had the spiritual moral. Not that the other two are, of course, not operating out of sublime principles, but I'd just like to express AJ's appreciation. We've covered a lot, but there's a lot more to cover, and I hope we'll have the opportunity maybe to have individual sessions with Andrew and with Colonel Kemp and with Hugh at some time in the future where we'll be able to flesh out these issues in greater depth. But at this point, the only thing that's left to say is Toda Rabah. Thank you very much, and best wishes.
Thanks, Ted. David, would you just like to make a few closing remarks?
Well, I think it's been a terrific session, and we will certainly invite the guests back individually to cover some subjects in more depth in the near future. I just want to let people know that next week we have a follow-on from this, but with a different dimension. We were talking tonight about the legal aspects mainly. Next week it will be the political aspects, and our guest is Martin Sherman, the director of the Jerusalem Institute of Strategic Studies, and the topic that he's nominated is about sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, the imperative for Israel to act and its puzzling reticence. So that'll be fascinating. And look, everyone needs support, and AJA is no different. So I'm just putting up on the screen now some practical things that we'd ask everyone to do. If you haven't done it yet, please like and follow the AJA Facebook page to have access to our news and views. If you want to join our email list, you send your name and email address to office@jewishassociation.org.au. And of course, we would invite Australian members of the Jewish community to consider membership, and anyone who can provide some practical support to do so. I mentioned Hugh's website of whosland.tv, where you can also support his cause and purchase a copy of the full film, and I'd encourage people to do so. So thank you very much, Alan, for being a superb MC again.
Thanks, David. Okay, that concludes the formal part of the evening.